So you watch these films
I've seen them a couple times.
hundreds of times, and how do you come to understand someone like Buster Keaton in a way of just deep appreciation for what he did?
Well, it's usually the good filmmakers that make it that makes it the easiest.
Yeah.
Because most silent filmmakers edited rhythmically. Chaplin obviously did because he was a musician, and he edited his films, and he often shot his films to music while they were on the studio, on the set, as they were acting.
He actually set up
A trio.
orchestra.
He had a trio. He had a little trio or one single pianist,
Yeah.
which I'll talk about in a minute too with the Gold Rush. But the and Keaton also edited in a very methodical and very musical way. So his films were it's quite apparent where the tempo is almost immediately. You can see what he's thinking in terms of rhythm. Bing bang bing bang bing bop bop, like that, and it never changed. It was just like this, and it was obvious that's the tempo of that scene. And so there's some things that are very easy. Harold Lloyd, on the other hand, was completely unmusical. Great filmmaker, beautiful filmmaker, really funny, but really difficult to write music to because they were edited in such a seemingly haphazard way and very difficult to accompany musically.
It's just because I was going to ask you a question at some point, either in relation to Charlie or some of these, but you and the film are collaborators, and you've just answered it to a certain extent. Some of those collaborations are beautiful and easy, and it makes sense, and others are a struggle.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, it depends when you're composing for silent films. And by the way, I mean, one of the reasons I love writing for Buster Keaton is because with Chaplin, I'm not actually able to compose because Charlie composed all his own music. So Keaton was the great opportunity to write for a comic genius where he didn't have any say about the music or have any prerequisites about the music. But yeah, I mean, working with Keaton in that regard, it is a great collaboration, but again, it's very much one-sided. But I will write sections and play it out musically to a scene and think that's not good enough, so I'll discard it. And with some films, I'm able to write maybe 30 seconds of music a day, and for a 3-hour film, that's a long time.
Yeah. I imagine there's always the. I mean, you have, as you've already described, you don't have the director there saying, "I don't want this. You have to change that." But on the other hand, I imagine there's, you have to be so tuned into the vision of the director and.
It helps to know the director really well and know their other films as well, besides the one you're doing. So you end up doing a lot of research about that director, and especially if that director did sound films later, where they did actually make decisions on what they liked musically in film.
Mm-hmm. And then in the case of you've done a lot of work with Shostakovich scores for silent film.
Yes,
or Saint-Saëns or others.
Yes, I restored the score for Shostakovich's only silent film called New Babylon, which I restored for Boozy and Hawks, and I was extremely fortunate enough to have Irina Shostakovich come to the world premiere performance of that, and put her stamp of approval on it. And so that Shostakovich wrote a silent film. A single silent film score. Camille Sasson wrote a score in 1908 for a film, and Pietro Mascagni, the great Italian opera composer, wrote a very beautiful score called Rhapsodia Satanica, which I'm currently restoring for the Mascagni family now.
Mm-hmm. And a friend in the audience tonight just turned us on to the fact that early conductor of the Seattle Symphony, Henry Hadley, wrote silent film music.
In fact.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating world, and I don't think people know that much about.
Well, I mean, you have to think about the fact that there were composers writing music all the time for new art forms.
Right.
So, I mean, it shouldn't surprise anybody that a classical hall composer would also write music for film, because it didn't have the stigma that it had later in life. later in history, that film music has, which was considered very lowbrow. Then it was extremely highbrow and extremely innovative.
So, how did you get connected with the Chaplin estate?
Well, I was, as I said before, I was guest conducting every year for the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra at that time for about 5 years. And the Chaplins had known that I had done some work for the Library of Congress. I restored the film score for Carmen by Cecil B. DeMille with music of Bizet, which was compiled by Hugo Riesenfeld. And I did some other restoration work, various little bits and bobs, Max Booting, for example, a lot of German expressionist films. And the Chaplins asked me if I'd be interested in coming out to Paris in 1998 to look at the manuscript of Modern Times, to see if that was something that I could be interested, that was doable to restore for live performance. And being a fan of that film my entire life, it took me about a half second to say yes. And I said, I'm sure we can do it, without seeing anything. And 2 weeks later, I was in Paris, which is where the headquarters of the Chaplins are now, after Chaplin was deported from the US in 1954. And I came to Paris, and there were 6 boxes in front of me in the office there that had not been opened since 1935. And so I pulled open the boxes, and I pulled out essentially the 40 versions of the score that Chaplin had made, and all the players' parts, which still existed. From that point on, I looked at it, and I was reading the music, and by reading the first page and hearing it all in my head, and it was, I don't think I moved from that table for a good 4 hours without saying anything, including Josephine Chaplin and Victoria Chaplin behind me in the next room going, well, what's going, So that was an amazing experience. And I said, yes, we can do that. And it took me 1.5 years to restore that score, Modern Times, which you'll see tonight. And I've been working for them ever since then. I've done 13 scores now for the Chaplin family, all written by Charlie.
So we're going to hear and see a little bit of the Gold Rush.
Yeah, this is the Gold Rush from 1925. And it's just a little clip, but perhaps you've seen it before. And this is a new recording.
You don't have to explain.
No, oh no, this is not.
I'm going to take you away from this life. I'm going away, and when I return, I shall come back.
Sorry, folks, this is not actually the right clip. This is a sound version that Charlie made in 1942 and re-released in the cinemas and narrated by Charlie. He took out all the intertitles and he narrated the entire film, which is quite fun, but it's not how he originally made it in 1925. So maybe, should we go on to the next one?
Yeah, I'll let them get set up and just ask you a few things
Sure.
in the meantime. So, what observations do you have about Charlie Chaplin as a silent movie composer? I mean, what is his language and his gift as far as you...
Well, you have to remember that Charlie grew up in a musical family. Both his parents were English music hall performers. His dad was a very famous Irish tenor named Charles Chaplin. And if you go in the lobby, actually, I don't know if that's still there, the computer's still running in the lobby, it is, you'll see some old photos I brought from the Chaplin archive of Charles Chaplin Sr. And what he did. His mother was also a singer in the English Music Hall, and he started in performing on stage at age 5 and was in a clog dancing group at that age, and played violin, played the organ, played the cello. Grew up completely surrounded by music and thought he was going to be a composer long before he thought he was going to be an actor. And in fact, when he became super famous in 1918, his aunt said that it's too bad that Charlie's doing this acting business because the world really lost a great composer.
I'll never forget doing the classical announcing in my early days at KUW, and I came across this recording from Swiss radio, and it was always these little cello miniatures,
Yeah.
short little pieces written by Charlie Chaplin.
Well, the cello is one of Charlie's favorite instruments. You'll see there's, again, a photo of Charlie playing the cello up there as
Right.
well, if you have a chance in the balcony up there to take a look at that. Yeah, it's always been a major part of his life, and in 1931 it gave him and he also started his own music publishing company in 1915, and published his own works for sheet music, and then in 1931 it gave him an opportunity to actually compose his own music for one of his own films, and that was a rather brave thing to do, to be as famous as Chaplin was and to write music that most people didn't even know he was a composer, and have it heard by millions of people all on the same day.
So he was so involved, in acting and directing and all the things he did. How much of did he ever get to conduct, or how was he involved in the actual making of the music?
Well, mind you, Chaplin could not actually notate all the music that he could play. It's very much the same, which is very common in the 1920s for especially a lot of songwriters. Irving Berlin, for instance, never learned how to read music either. Not many people know that, but he played everything in F sharp major. Berlin did, and he had a little lever that changed the key on his piano. Anyway, Chaplin was always had to have someone to write down his manuscript and write down his pieces of music, and then he would listen to the recording. Anyway, this is a new recording that we made of the Gold Rush, which has a very famous scene. That was a recording that we made with the London Symphony about 7 or 8 years ago, which we now do live.
So we're going to move through a few of these because I really want to get a taste of Chaplin. What comes to mind when we talk about A Night in the Show, the work you've done with this, or
Yeah. A Night in the Show is a film that Charlie made very early on in his career. You have to remember that, and you'll see Chaplin here rarely in not his vagabond outfit. You have to remember that Chaplin, I don't know if you know the story of how he became the tramp, but he was hired by Mack Sennett to come and just show up and maybe do some funny business on camera, see if he was usable. This is 1914. So they said, well, Charlie was thinking we need to have some kind of funny situation. So there was this auto race that was happening in Venice, California. In fact, it was for kids, and it's called Kid Auto Races. And Chaplin thought to himself, okay, I need some funny costume. And so he went into the costume department and said, bowler hat, small mustache, baggy pants, cane, little vest. Okay, let's go. They shot the film in 45 minutes. Came back, and Chaplin had to wear that exact same outfit for the rest of his career. He literally took about 20 seconds to pick out his outfit that he became most famous for. And what was the question? Oh, yes, The Night in the Show. This is actually Chaplin, before he became a performer in film in America, he was with a company called the Fred Carnot Company, which is an English music hall, a very famous English music hall touring company, and they were making a tour of the United States, and that's where Mack Sennett saw him and asked him to come to the studios. And he made a film of one of his routines that he made with the Fred Carnot Company. So you see him in a very elegant outfit, and this is A Night in the Show from 1915. He's not ready yet. Well,
let me ask you this, because most of these the Chaplin material tonight will be Charlie's music.
Oh yes, right. I didn't tell you that. This is actually because Charlie wrote, as I said, 13 film scores of his mostly features and a few shorts. But his early films, like in the Mutuals, the S&As, there was no music existing. He didn't write music for a lot of these films. And this is my only opportunity to actually write music for Charlie Chaplin that he didn't write, so that I got to compose from my own brain for a Chaplin film. And I think we're ready for that. Night is The Night in the Show. Wait, that's not what that's not it. Sorry. Although it looks like an awfully big hammer in Charlie's hand. Something funny's about to happen, I can tell, but I don't think that's what we're supposed to see. Poor guy, he's got all these discs I had to bring from Europe, and he's like trying to put them all together.
Here we go.
Yeah, Shanghai, that looked like that. That looked like that was one down.
You had it there.
Yes, he did.
Oh. Okay, it'll take a minute.
Okay.
So you're writing.
I'm writing, yeah, I get a chance to write for Chaplin, and I try not to write a lot like Chaplin, but you of course, you can't ignore Chaplin when you compose a music for a Chaplin film. The greatest, people always ask me, how is Chaplin as a composer, you know? And I say, he's the greatest composer in the world for Chaplin films, because he knows his films, he knows his characters very intimately. And so you can't completely ignore Chaplin. He obviously has to have somewhat of an influence. But the most thing that I tried to use as a model for A Night in the Show was music from the English Music Hall. Because you have to remember, if you've ever been to I mean, that doesn't really exist anymore, but it does, but in a much more sort of touristy way. But if English music which is essentially the equivalent of British vaudeville, the music was very different than you would expect, American audiences would expect. And the fact that the music is very delicate, it's very graceful, and it counteracts the comedy, which is what Chaplin's philosophy. Here we go. There's Chaplin there in the front row.
So once again, this was your score.
Yes, that's my music.
Yeah. So and the little that I've heard of Charlie Chaplin's scores, I really get that you were, very influenced by him and the way he would do the scores, at least to my hearing.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's an influence of Chaplin and what Chaplin would have heard and that he would have applied in 1915.
Yeah.
So again, I try not to write music that would be too far beyond 1915 stylistically, because that's when the film comes from. Mm-hmm. And so therefore I had to think about what Chaplin would have heard when he was with Carnot.
Yeah. You might touch on this in your introduction to Modern Times, so I don't want to steal any thunder, but you talked about sitting in front of those boxes at the archive, and all the work and possibilities. What were you able to do, or what did you have to do in terms of restoration? Is it putting together a lot of those different versions that he had, finding parts, writing new parts, probably all
to write to use as an example, I always use Modern Times as the great model for restoring a Chaplin film, because it was the biggest job and the most intricate. As I said, there were 5 boxes in front of me of Chaplin material, and when I looked at it in Paris, I couldn't quite get into all of it, obviously. I was just there just to see if it was actually doable. And what they did was they photostated all of the original score. And the original score, if you put all together all the different versions that Charlie had made, was about 2.5 feet thick. Because Charlie, it was very much Charlie exactly how he was as a filmmaker. Charlie, if you know anything about Chaplin as a filmmaker, Charlie would try things over and over and over and over again until he thought it was funny or that it worked. Like the opening of City Lights, for example, with the flower and the flower girl with Virginia Cheryl. He shot the same shot of Virginia Cheryl handing Chaplin a flower like that 312 times. Until he said, no, that's not it. It's like this. And she goes, I like this. So he said, no, I mean, Virginia Cheryl is supposedly not the brightest bulb in the Christmas tree, but still, he was a perfectionist. Well, he did the same thing musically. He would listen to something, and because he couldn't read the music, he would have to listen to an orchestra play it, and then decide whether or not it was good enough. So when they recorded Modern Times, it took him 6 weeks to record a film score for one film. Now, let me put this into modern terms. Most contemporary film scores are recorded in about 6 hours at the most. So he took 6 weeks and employed an orchestra full time. And it was the Fox Orchestra. It wasn't even his orchestra. It was Alfred Newman's orchestra. And but it was Charlie's money. He was the producer. He could afford to do it, and he loved musicians, so he hung around them all the time. But when they would do these recording sessions, Charlie would make changes on the fly. I'm going to actually talk about this in modern times a little bit at the introduction. But I found little bits of paper where a trumpet player had one line he was supposed to read, but they didn't have enough manuscript paper, so the trumpet player would write it on the back of a restaurant menu, or on the back of a laundry receipt, or I saw 4 parking tickets right on Sunset and La Brea. And it's people would just write music wherever they could. So I had to put all that stuff together and put it in the right place. So it's a bit of detective work for each film.
So if we've got this, we're going to do 2 more clips and we'll wrap up this.
2 more? City and Modern or Immigrant?
I think we got Immigrant.
Let's.
He's got Immigrant out.
Immigrant.
Okay.
Yeah, which is great because this is another one of Tim's scores.
Yeah,
here.
again, this is the Immigrant, which is the one they gave me a choice of any of the 12 Mutual films that Charlie made, which are all Mutual films, are the 20-minute films he made for the Mutual company, and which is still Mutual Radio, by the way, still the same company, and it's The Immigrant, and it's a very famous film about Charlie who immigrates on the boat. Well, you'll see it in a minute, but I wanted to do this film because it's a great landmark film, and I'm really glad that I decided to do it, which was 2 years ago, and I'm particularly happy about doing it now because I feel like it's extremely symbolic of what we're going through now, very much so, and Chaplin was very much a visionary, and I feel very lucky that I chose that one. Oh, hello.
I want to bring the conversation full circle. So if you go to, how many people go to the Luna Park Cafe? Have you see the Granada Theater sign there? Have you ever looked in the back in the old Granada Theater sign? I love that. I'm just curious how much of the kid that used to hang out at the Granada Theater, and you and I went to Jacques Tati movies together as kind of neo-silent filmmaker, and we played music together in this goofy house band of cello and saxophone and drums and trumpet called the West Boogie Band, and Tim played in a rock and roll band, and there's a lot of crazy influences that have kind of made up your career and taken you where you've gone. Is the person who's sitting in front of the Chicago Symphony conducting City Lights pretty much the same person that was hanging out at the Granada Theater?
Yeah. I mean, of course it is. It's the same guy who played Rock'em Sock'em Robots in your basement. It's the same guy who went to West Seattle High School, class of '81. Hung out. Most of my senior year, I was at Mr. Ed's. Michelle, is that you? Wow, I haven't seen you in 30 years. Fantastic. Wow, that's great. It's like, there's that. Oh, I know her. It's all part of the. It's all part of the scene. I mean, I don't know, Dave. What a question.
Well, I know it was a broad question.
I mean, I feel like myself in front of New York Phil or whatever. I feel myself in front of the Milwaukee Symphony. I feel, it's or playing, for example. We did 2 performances of City Lights for free in the middle of Mexico City, in the Piazza Mayor, which was free, and there was about 20,000 people, and it was raining. And, it's just, Chaplin, especially Chaplin, is incredibly universal, and it speaks to a lot of people, and I think it's more than relevant to today. And he speaks so many different languages without speaking at all.
Yeah. Well, City Lights. Tell me about City Lights and why you love this
City
film.
Lights is probably considered Chaplin's probably his most famous film and his masterpiece. And it's the one I conduct probably more often than the one I conduct the most of all the Chaplin's films. I have about 100 concerts a year, and about 75% of them are Chaplin films. And so City Lights is the one that people ask for the most. It's an extremely beautiful film and an extremely poignant ending. I don't know how many people have seen City Lights, but if you can imagine City Lights without this music, especially the ending of City Lights, without Chaplin's music, it would be a completely different film. However, the scene we're going to see is one of the opening scenes of City Lights, not the very opening scene, but the next one, when Charlie is using music here quite well to convey the the dilemma that Charlie has of looking at a statue in a store window of an unclothed woman. But he doesn't want to look like he's staring too much. And the music is very dignified and tells very clearly what Chaplin is thinking as he's looking at this. And it's very, very interesting to see how he uses music in this way. And this is Chaplin's first film score, 1931. That's the genius of Chaplin in music. That's why there's no better composer for Chaplin films than Chaplin himself.
Well, Tim, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. Thank you all so much. Clay, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
A big round of applause for Tim and Dave. We ran over, we had a little technical difficulty, but this is just an exquisite evening, and we're going to let you go for intermission. I give you, once again, Timothy Brock.
Thank you, Clay. So, we're about to see one of really Chaplin's three big masterpieces, which is considered City Lights, and The Gold Rush, and Modern Times. You have to remember that sound came in 1927, and Chaplin had always intended City Lights, which came out in 1931, to be a silent film. But you know, that's 4 years after sound had already come in. No one was making silent films at all. But Chaplin decided that he still felt like that the Tramp should make at least one more film, and we're very glad he did, because it's really his masterpiece. So by 1935, which is when they went into production for Modern Times, now we're getting into really ridiculous territory, because it is a good 8 years after sound had already come in. Now, when Charlie went into production in 1935, he actually originally intended it to be a sound film. And in the archives, you'll see actual dialogue, pages of dialogue of the Tramp talking. And Paulette Goddard, the Paulette Goddard character of the gamin in Modern Times, had all these crazy things happening to her, like she went into the nunnery, and Charlie was supposed to enter in World War I, and then came out, and then they discovered each other. He was trying to make it sort of a bigger epic than it actually ended up being, which was a great film about social commentary about the worker, and it's one of the reasons that, you'll see also, because Charlie's FBI file, which was released about 6 years ago. There's an entire book on Modern Times and the implications it meant, and you can read he has a vast FBI file by the time Chaplin was deported in 1954. Now, it was a very interesting thing for him to do in terms of film history. Musically, Charlie had only written one film score by this time, and that's City Lights. It's a great film score. It's for kind of a small foxtrot band. It's about 34 players, and that is small in Hollywood terms. And it uses quite a bit of music that would be very contemporary of the day. A lot of foxtrots, a lot of orchestrina, as they would call it, type of tunes, including La Valletera, which is written by Jose Padilla. Well, Modern Times he was so bitten by the music bug that when he decided to make Modern Times, he thought, I need to make a bigger orchestra. Well, he tripled the size of the orchestra to about 70 players. Okay, that's not triple. My math was not my best subject in West Seattle High School. Okay, admittedly. However, it was a lot bigger. And as I said in the first part, he did everything by trial and error. He wrote like lots of bits of music, and he would go into the studio and listen to something and change it on the fly. Now, changing it on the fly in Hollywood terms is not exactly the right phrase to use, because on the fly means essentially what David Raxon, as you may remember, who's the composer of Laura and some other great golden age of Hollywood film scores. This was his first job working as Chaplin's musical associate. What that musical associate is, by the way, is the guy who writes down what Chaplin's playing on the violin or on the piano or on the cello. And Chaplin would come into the studio at 9 o'clock every morning on Sunset in La Brea, which, by the way, those studios are still there. You'll see exactly the building that Charlie built to this day, which is still there, except it has Kermit the Frog on it now, in a Chaplin costume. And when Chaplin left the U.S. in 1954, it's where they shot Superman. So, in fact, Jack Larson, who's Jimmy Olsen, used to come to every LA Chamber Orchestra performance I gave there of Chaplin music, and he would bring with him the original wrenches, which he found at the studio. So anyway, I get distracted. I'm trying to make this shorter because we're running a little bit late. But essentially, Chaplin would get to the studio at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he would work on 2 minutes of the film every day. So he would sit down with David Raxon and play on the piano or on the violin a section of the film that they had in a moviola, which is a viewer of a film that would run forwards and backwards, which makes it easier for him to run little bits of music and then play little bits and then see how it looks while David played what he wrote down and then played it back. Anyway, David would make what's known as a short score, which is 5 lines of what Charlie wrote, and said, this is the tune, this is the chord structure. And then he would come back with this 5 score, and then he would sit down with Charlie and orchestrate from that point. So he would sit down and say, okay, this line here, like that. He'd say, that should be oboe. And then the cello's line is this, blah, 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 blah. And then the brass should play this chord, like that. And then David would write all this down. Then he would take that score and then take it home and then orchestrate it for 65 to 70 players. And then from that point, they would have to mimeograph players' parts, make players' parts, mimeograph them all, give them to the players, and once they had enough music collected, which usually is about 10 minutes of music at a time, they give it to the musicians. Charlie would listen to it once and go, no, that's not good, let's do it again. This is why it took 6 weeks to record this score, and that's a lifetime in Hollywood terms. But Charlie would play things over and over and over, and we recently got, about 5 years ago, the acetates, the original acetates, to the Modern Times recording session. And you can hear Alfred Newman swearing up a blue streak at Chaplin going, what do you mean that's not good enough? He says, Chaplin's like, no, 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 no. And they're yelling back and forth. I don't know why they kept the record button on. It's very expensive acetate. But there's this great documentation of Al Newman getting furious. And in fact, Alfred Newman, it was David Raxon got fired 1 week after being hired by Chaplin on Modern Times, and was sent back to Philadelphia, was told to go back to Philadelphia. But Alfred Newman stuck up for David Raxon, because David Raxon, who was 23 at the time, actually had enough nerve to say no to Chaplin. Music wasn't quite good enough. No one says no to Chaplin. But in Hollywood, in between 1931 and 1954, there was a little club called the Badge of Honor Club, which is all the musical associates who've been fired by Chaplin. And that's every film. Chaplin fired his musical associate at least once on every film up to 1959. So they had a little club going, which was, I thought, very cute. But anyway, when restoring this score, I had these 5 boxes that nobody had seen since 1935, quite dusty, but it was a great pleasure to sort of piece everything back together, and it took such a long time, which is why the Chaplins gave me 2 years to do it. but it was worth doing. And we, for up to about 3 years ago, most people have only heard the Modern Times soundtrack from the original recording from 1936. That's how we all knew the film. We seen it on television, most of us, but sometimes you go into a theater and you see Modern Times, and that's an old recording. Now, what's on that recording is about 60% of what's actually on paper. Because if you read the score on paper, there's all this stuff going on that you have no idea was happening. So the only people that are actually hearing Modern Times as Charlie heard it in 1936 is the people who would come to my live performances, because I was the only one who was able to conduct this for the first 10 years because it was too difficult, because I had to do it from memory. So the only people that could actually hear what Charlie actually wrote were the people who came to the live performances. And then we recorded it in Berlin, and at least in Europe, it's been re-released cinematically, if you can believe it, in France, all over France. They released it with the new recording that you're about to hear, which is the first time in the US you'll actually hear this recording with this film. So this is a recording that we made over 10 days' time, and that's it. That's all I can think of at the moment. I just tried to wrap that up quickly. I hope you enjoy it. It's Modern Times, 1936.
I just have one more thing to say. Tim, please keep standing. For the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and for West Seattle's Admiral Theater, Tim Brock came tonight to do this out of the goodness of his heart. Can you raise the roof, please, for him before we see this film?
Have a good time.